MuMMIA.Project. My name is Fabio Geffi from CGIL Lombardy. As Gabriele said, I thank you for asking me to be your moderator for this roundtable, which, as Gabriele was anticipating, is covering the more political perspective of these committees, rather the transnational representation for the interests of the workers in this perspective of transnational companies. I will not waste time to leave the more time to the speakers, but I just want to mention a couple of things that I'm fond of in this context of EWCs, these organizations that exist thanks to a law that emerged in this political institutional context, and this European Union that sees its perimeter affected by many and almost all the parts of the world by a very tough crisis that evidenced how the continental and transnational level of the management of certain problems or establishment or certain strategies is undoubtedly prevailing, or maybe not prevailing, but one of the main fact one of the main principal ways to launch factors of reaction. These EWCs represent a case to evaluate, and they respond to a strategic priority or the unionism or the coordination of union relations. The transnationalization is the capacity to produce a network that can establish a course, an approach to build up a European and effective union context. But this should not deviate us. It should not, in my opinion, prevent us from facing in a very practical way some issues that have to do with the approach to the functioning of the EWCs that are not at all far from the political evaluation and the strategic function of the union of organizations such as EWCs. On the contrary, they focus on some key issues of the union action at the transnational level, and they are translated well in this contextualization of the EWCs in the researches that you saw yesterday. The researchers that we saw yesterday presented some results that underline some critical aspects. These critical aspects are certainly well known, but they highlight the existence of some important obstacles that need to be faced. As far as the constitution of an EWC for the functioning of a representation in a transnational context, we have to acquire information about the characteristics of the transnational company. We must acquire and be familiar with information, something like the DNA of the union organizations that could cooperate in the context of these union organizations within sectors, and we must involve the representatives of the workers in the processes so they may also become players in this coordination. This is a factor that can be managed, but which presents many difficulties connected to the need for training, the need for unionization in this context of EWCs, and especially involving representatives and workers in the multinational context due to the difficulties that are connected to the malfunctioning of EWCs. And this is not an isolated case, because the EWC can exist. It is truly a challenge for the union by producing representatives that are not completely connected to the representatives, and this is our challenge. And we must face this type of issues undoubtedly, and this is the most specific case with respect to this project. But the characteristics of FICAM as a promoter of this project, the fact that multinationals are articulated on areas of intervention, production, or sale that are different, and which produce a context of multisectoriality that has to be reproduced in the context of an EWC in a multinational, and in turn, this further highlights the issues of union coordination, transversal issues, and the industrial relations, not only among different cultural contexts because belonging to different states of the European Union, but also because they belong to different contexts as far as representation. So we could refer to different federations, also with respect to the affiliation to European organizations, but not only this, also national levels and federations and coverage of sectors or collective bargaining. These are problems that are highly technical, but in my opinion, they're just technical on the surface. They're strongly, intensely political, and that require political strategies to be faced and approached. It is here that I raise my question that I hope that will be answered briefly. And I also try to have a focus on concrete characteristics that respond to technical issues, but with a strong political notes. What are your opinions? I now address Marina, that in sequence to all the participants to this panel. Well, what are, in your opinion, the answers that has to be provided from an operational and strategic perspective to this type of issues that are very practical, but very critical and important from a standpoint of union strategy? Marina, your first turn to you. I suggest to stay on a response of 3 minutes. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. I'll be quite frank and direct in my answer when it's about EWCs, so representation of the interest of workers at the multinational level. One of the fundamental responses that can be provided to the Fabio's question
sulla effettiva implementazione
lies in the strengthening and the surveillance of the European legislation that exists. It is one of the few cases in which we can boast a European legislation that effectively creates a level of exchange
effettivo terreno di
and actual participation ground for the workers in a ample and varied and complicated dimension that moves much quicker than the union, which cannot always catch up with it. But this is a legislation that was somewhat renewed, and which, in the context of the regulation that the European Union provides as to these rights for consultation, it presents some particularly beneficial and advanced features. The directive is probably not the best possible tool. The application of the directive has not yet fully responded to the most recent needs, the needs that required this application to enforce these rights of the workers at a transnational level. From this standpoint, a first critical core of activities has to do with the monitoring of the instrument, so the application of the legislation at a European and national level, but also a monitoring of the level on which very often the responsibilities to implement the rights are unloaded, that is, the level of negotiation of agreements. So, the support we receive, especially from chess regarding the surveillance of this, the fullness of this legislation means obviously to ensure that these prerogatives do not stay on paper, we must provide a good degree of support to the players that must implement these. And here, certainly not the only, but the first key to interpret this and to enforce it has to do with the strengthening of the coordination between among representatives of workers, especially when we're dealing with multinationals or very complex and fragmented realities, which are not all represented as satisfactorily inside within the EWC, although the directive provides for this possibility. Particularly, the coordination is fundamental and crucial in cases of not only restructuring, such as defensive backup cases, but also in cases of foreseeing a change to make sure that the rights of information, participation, and consultation in multinationals can achieve effective and proactive results to the benefit of the European workforce. Thank you, Marina, for this contextualization from the standpoint of chess. I will now leave the floor to Fausto, because if we talk about multi-sector and coordination from the Confederation standpoint, such as CGIL, it is important to understand the role of a national player that coordinates the sector at a time that sectors must be coordinated at a transnational level. Yes, it is inevitable for this dimension, this multi-sectorial dimension. This dimension complicates the activity of constitution, negotiation, and negotiation with the companies, because it anticipates a need to join different players to often summon subjects that intervene on different negotiation levels at a national level. And in addition, as far as the European coordination, this has to do with reasoning with European federations, sector federations that are structured differently one from the other. So from this standpoint, the reflection that Philcom's decided to implement through this project is useful also for a of the elaboration of a confederation for all the unions in Italy and also at a European level, to understand how we can better operate with respect to multisectorial companies, and before the need to better coordinate the national activity on a European scale in this type of companies, and in light of the complexity that we have mentioned. The point that I'd like to respond to in a couple of minutes, or continue responding to in a couple of minutes, is that it seems to me that in the case of these companies, even the cases which were presented yesterday prove this, the need to strengthen the mechanisms anticipated by this directive as far as information, consultation, and participation of workers to the life and choices of the company on a transnational scale is in these companies specifically an accentuated need because it is these are companies in which the process of restructuring and of redefining of productive missions or work contexts or relocation and reorganization of work and service offering is in constant change and evolution. And I believe that without a strengthening of our capacity of establishing quickly European tools for the information and participation that the directive allows us to establish our capacity, the capacity of the union, the representation at a company level of national federations, the European Union to respond to these processes will always be delayed with respect to the dynamic, to the complicated dynamic within companies. So we must reflect on the national enforcement of the directives, the need for parliaments to start intervening not only to transfer at a national level the European directives, but also to start with independent directives at national levels. These who are especially on paper now must be insisted on as national confederations or category organizations and also as European unions, if I can say. These have to do with how the union work is performed within these transnational companies in a more direct manner that cannot only stay at the level of European confederations, but from the standpoint of the encouragement toward the Commission, to the Parliament, to the European level, to each representatives. I'm thinking about what is being done by the Spaniard Parliament member Cerca regarding the right to information that can anticipate changes within companies, or for example, regarding the possibility of workers to participate in to choices that have to do with important consequences for workers or processes of reorganizations to redefine the company. Well, all these tasks have to be based at a union level on a possibility that is more effective and more concrete of what we've been able to do so far. Thank you, Fausto. And now from the Confederation, we're going to call another player that represents maybe the European Federation, the EFAT, Aston O'Howard. What do you think about this systemic approach to all these problems that we have mentioned so far, technical, political, and at the union level?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, to feel comes to organize this project and this conference. I think it's very important. I also like the composition of the colleagues here. So I would like to say a few words, some reflections on this from European Trade Union Federation of view. I'm not sure I will be able to do it in 3 minutes, so but probably I will have a couple of minutes more. So I think dealing with European Works Council is already quite difficult, I would say, if it's only one sector. If it's a company operating only in one sector. But I think it's clear that it's becoming more complicated if there are more sectors involved. But I think it's not a new problem. I mean, we are dealing with multisectoral European Works Councils for many, many years. I remember in the early years, Sara Lee, Unilever, they were always concerning more sectors. So we always had cooperation with the chemical unions. Peter might remember this. So I think we heard a lot about the problems. Peter highlighted them, but also Volker and Paul from the tourism sector. But I think we are here now more to talk about solutions. If I look at this from a my sector point of view, I just had a small overview. So there are about 25 companies operating in the tourism sector who are actually dealing with European Works Councils. Out of them, I'm personally dealing directly with 7 of them. There are 7 where we should do more, on negotiation functioning. There are 4 where other trade union federations are in charge. There are 5 where we don't have any idea what's going on there. And there are about 10 out of them which are multisectoral. So just to have an idea. And there are some more transnational companies out there where we should also discuss setting up European Works Councils. So how do we deal with this at effort level? So we, as who said it yesterday, we have more than 100 transnational companies in our sectors. So effort tries to deal with this workload by nominating coordinators. So we have the policy that we try to find for each transnational company one coordinator. This is normally a national trade union officer of the country where the mother company is, where the headquarter is, because there the trade unions have a good access normally to central management. They should act on behalf of effort, of the whole European workforce, and they should, in the best case, also, to prepare, to be the interlocutor of central management, prepare meetings, follow-up meetings, and in the best case also to report back to effort and to the national unions. So we have some cases where this works very, very well. Gabriele is one example. He coordinates the Autogrill European Works Council. We have a very good case, other case, Compass, where we have the British Trade Union coordinating this. We have a Club Méditerranée, where our French colleague Christian is coordinating. So this, in some cases, that happens very well, but in some other cases, this does not. So I think it is so this would be one of my first recommendations or conclusions. We really need very close coordination between all the different levels, national level, local level, European level, to deal with those multisectoral. So how do we organize multisectoral coordination? Normally it's ad hoc. So if there's a company coming up where European Works Council should be set up, so then the European trade union federations in charge just sit together, see how is the company structured, which sectors are the biggest, where are the most members, which national trade unions are affiliated to which European trade union federation. So then normally we reach agreement and then we go ahead. So I think this is already done. In some cases this is very obvious. For instance, like TUI or Thomas Cook in my sector, which is travel agencies, tour operators. It's clear it has to be UNI who organizes this. Also another case, LSG Skychefs, for instance, airline catering. It's mainly transport, so it was ETF organizing this, always in cooperation with us. We were talking about a database. I think it's good. I really liked Romuald's presentation about the database of European Works Councils. So because this information and data are very important, but I think we also are all aware that these data are constantly changing. So effort did several attempts to set up databases, European Works Council database. I think we never really succeeded. Just it's also very time consuming to do this, and then you really need much time to update. So, and for instance, in my sector, we just actually try to map the hotel chains in Europe. Try to map them with regard to where are the subsidiaries, what is their legal structure, what is the workforce, what is the trade union density, what is the workers' representation. It's not really a big success, I must say. So it's really difficult, I think, to get this coherent data and also to constantly update it. So this, therefore, my second recommendation, conclusion is databases, yes, but it's not feasible to have it really coherent. I think it's probably better to collect data on transnational companies ad hoc when it's really needed. So if you really want to deal on a certain issue. One more example on multisectoral coordination. There's also a very interesting case, I think, from my sector in the contract catering sector, because in this sector now the big players European-wide are all moving into different fields. So contract catering companies are also now doing cleaning, security. Security companies or cleaning companies are moving into food service. So we see this in some of those, and those companies also have European Works Councils. And here actually we want to make sure that all the European Works Councils and all those companies also represent all the different subsectors. And here we started talks with Uni Europa, to make sure that we achieve this. And I would also like in this respect thank Marina, because ETUI is actually doing a big restructuring project where they give slots to all the different European trade union federations, and we are planning to do one meeting on contract catering plus other facility management companies to bring together national officers and the European Works Council members in this meeting. But, as you said also before, these are often very technical, structural, administrative problems. I think we have to deal with them because it's our daily bread, but I think we also have to make sure that we use the European Works Councils politically. I mean, normally they are there to help us to defend the rights of and the interests of workers, to achieve social progress. And I think we also have to make sure that we use the right to information and consultation to fight restructuring. We see that in many transnational companies that the crisis is used as an excuse now to downsize, to relocate, to restructure. And here I think we should much more use the European Works Council to defend the rights of the workers. Another point, very important, I think, is also to use the European Works Councils politically to organize much more workers. We see that in many countries, in many sectors, there's a very low organization in the transnational companies, and particularly in some countries. We see this, for instance, particularly in the Central and Eastern European countries, where the trade unions did not really achieve to organize the transnational companies, which makes then the European Works Councils very weak. So this is what I see in the daily practice. So my third recommendation is really to try to use European Works Councils much more politically, much more for the trade union purpose. I think a very interesting aspect of this is that in many transnational companies, in many sectors, the global union federations are also dealing with those companies and try to reach, or already have reached, global agreements. And we come to this, I think, in the next session. So where it's more about workers' rights. And I think here this can be very complementary. So the work of what the global unions are doing with regard to international framework agreements and what we are doing in the European Works Councils, because in many companies we also see a mutual support, and for instance also in some European Works Councils we raise global issues also of breach of workers' rights, and so really to support also global issues. Last but not least, for me, the biggest problem in all this is really the question of resources. So I mean, if I look at effort, more than 100 European Works Councils, we have normally one position of one officer in the Secretariat who is responsible for transnational companies' European Works Councils. I'm in the tourism sector, I'm dealing with more than 20 transnational companies, beside all the other work I'm doing, like tourism policy, social dialogue at European level. So I think, and I think it's the same for the national coordinators. I mean, all the work we are doing on European Works Council is on top of what we are actually doing. So for me, this is the fourth more question than conclusion. I think we really have to discuss how can we get more human but also financial resources for European Works Council work, for work on transnational companies at national and at European level. And I mean, this is for me also a political question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kerstin. Io credo che nella conclusione
I believe that in your conclusions and in your intervention in particular, you touched upon a central issue of trade union strategy. And I think that this wish that you expressed has its first points of reference in the national trade unions organizations that are affiliated to the European federations of the sectors. I would like to give the floor immediately to Hélène Debord from the CFDT. She's a secretary for the sector, to give her opinion about this topic and on the questions asked in my presentation. Good morning, everyone. we talked about various questions, and especially on the legislative follow-up that has greatly improved. But I would like to insist on the fact that this is not sufficient. And today I would like, what can make EWC progress? Well, based on this legislative case, it depends on our will. It depends on us, on our individual and collective will, because we have to do lots and lots of things together. Today, the European Works Councils are progressing too slowly, taking into consideration the rapidity with which multinational companies work. It's important to organize our trade union response at the trade union level, but that was discussed various times from the beginning of this Florence workshop. Talking about the collective and individual commitment, so this will that was referred to earlier, well, to say something about this, I would like to present two main arguments. The Actalis. Actalis is an example. This company that illustrates the difficulty in setting up EWCs. This multinational is located in France, Italy, and Spain, and we already did many things to create an EWC, especially, I would say, without 5 signatures have been given by the Spaniards, and then the UGT and EGEA in France, and the letter was sent to the Spanish and French managers, and it says that in France we have a trade union team that is rather weak, and it's not completely aware of the interests that might be involved in the creation and the setting up of an EWC. Christine was saying earlier, we cannot just talk about problems. I try to be to propose some solutions as well. With reference to our trade union team in France, it's important to have contacts with the Italians that are very motivated in the same company, together with the Spaniards as well, to try to build these the strategies. It's going to be us who will explain things. It's important to do this at the EWC level. Effort in Paris will do that. All these are the proposals to say that this network that we want to create today depends on our will, and this network might be highly operational, so that the workers may talk to one another to acknowledge what's at stake and the challenges. I'm talking about Lactalis. This is a French case, but also a Spanish and Italian case. It's a multinational case. We have the same problem with Intersnack, Belvedere, and other companies. We have the same topics, the same issues, and we might set up a policy to make things happen more quickly. Well, second argument, a question actually, with reference to precarious work. Precarious work is a slogan of the EFET conference in Brussels. It's a topic that we have to discuss every day in our daily practice. And I would like to underline the fact that the EWC could be a very interesting tool and a very useful tool to be able to progress with the precarious work issues that concern lots of transnational companies. And also in the meat sector, for example, of the agricultural and food sector, but also in the agricultural sector like Bonduelle, that is typically French and is a transnational company. It's a big multinational company, because we know that actually it's the entire chain from the cultivation of vegetables until they're freezing. So it's a complex chain, food chain. This should be on the agenda of the EWCs, with a request that should be formulated by all of us that are convened here, especially talking about corporate social responsibility, but going beyond the legislative system, but also to reach collective agreements that might regulate the also the issue of social dumping and other issues that have been tackled so far. So the legislative framework is, as I said earlier, we should try and have stronger alliances to progress at the same speed as a multinational to organize a political strategy that is as effective as theirs strategy.
Merci Hélène de ton intervention.
Thank you, Hélène, for your intervention. Now we give the floor to another country. So we move on to a different federation. Ken Rees from Belgium, LBC. What's your opinion? How do you see the strategy from your viewpoint?
No.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. The strategy. I think most of the elements about strategy have been brought onto the table, so I do not necessarily have to repeat what has been said. I think if I look to the two sectors that I'm responsible for, the media sector, and especially the ICT sector, in practice, you see a concentration on a lot of the problems that we're talking about in the other sectors. Let's say, I think the level of internationalization and the cross-sectoral aspects of that sector is very evident. You know, people working in that sector work internationally on a daily basis. They have their manager can work in Belgium, and your first line manager is in Finland, and your second line manager is somewhere in the United States, and he sends you emails to order you around, and they decide what happens to your career and so on. And so they travel around. So there are international companies in real life already. It's not just that the boss is outside, the actual owner. It's on a day-to-day basis that your actual manager can be wherever in the world. Yeah? It's by definition multisectoral, because you have manufacturing, you have services, they constantly try to explore new markets and new activities. So let's say all the aspects are there, and over the last few years we have been experimenting, I think, with all the propositions formulated here by the federations and by the trade unions. We've tried to create alliances that are, let's say, trans-federation alliances. I think one of the examples is the HP one that's in the documents of the conference, where we say it's a joint industrial and union alliance. We have one for IBM functioning like that. We've invested the last few years quite a lot in training to actually sell the idea of EWC coordination, because in the ICT sector, trade union levels are very, very low. That's the second aspect of what you see, that it's incredibly internationally integrated, but it's not the stronghold of trade unionism traditionally. So even at the national level, we have to build trade unions, let alone at the international level. So we are there in the SWOT thing from yesterday in such a situation that it's easy to coordinate internationally, because even national organizations are hoping that they can get something back to strengthen their national position, which is not always the case in many other companies. But it brings me, when I look to all the, let's say, the practical issues, brings me to a few thoughts on maybe on the next point, because I think thinking about new strategies, new tools is not something that is very urgent, because all the strategy discussions we've had, the tools are there. If we had the presentations yesterday for instance, the EWC database and worker participation, they're incredibly marvelous tools. I completely agree that European Trade Union Federations is actually the only player in the field, even if you look to the Commission or to companies, it actually has working tools to go. And so we shouldn't wait to have more tools. That's not the priority today. We have to elaborate, we have to continue, but if you look to the figures, you see we have 1,400 and something companies not yet organized. And he says, and we know that there are maybe hundreds that we don't know about. Well, the hundreds we don't know about might become a problem if we succeed in organizing 1,300 of the 1,400 we already know about, and I don't see that happening in the next 24 months. So that's not a priority. We have to start working today and start organizing those companies. Yeah. And then I come, when I look in practice to my internationally organized sector, I actually see two issues that on the midterm we really have to think about. And then that's adding an aspect I want to do in the debate. It's adding the trade union psychological aspect. We have to start looking differently to the sectors, as well inside our trade unions, as the way we relate ourselves to European Trade Union Federations and the way European Trade Union Federations operate. And if you allow me 2 minutes, I'll try to be short. Before I got reskilled in trade union affairs, I used to work as a historian. And if I look back to Belgian history, I'm reliving part of our national history basically today. I've been reliving that for the last 10 years. Today we are called trade unions. If you actually translate literally in Dutch, it's central trade unions. It's actually basically the real term. And that comes from an era, end 19th century and the early 20th century. We had all kinds of local federations popping up, local trade unions popping up. They were very democratically organized, very local, very close to the real life of workers. But the problem was basically that they tried to form national organizations because the companies were nationally organized. And they were called federations. By chance, the same term we use for the European trade union federations today. And they were federations, not central trade unions, because they said, well, we cooperate, meaning that we decide every year how much money are we going to give to the federation, what are we going to do together, will we make a publication or not, will we hire someone at the national level or not, maybe, but if we put money there, then there's a problem because we have less locally and we want to organize something locally, and that might be a problem. The debates there, the decision-making was at the local level, basically, and not at the federation level, because they had to travel half a day sometimes to meet, even in a small country as Belgium. If in 1890 you had to go from the west to the east, it's 150 kilometers, but you were a day on the way, so they had meetings for a week. They traveled a day, they had a meeting for a few days, they decided something, they traveled back for a day, they came locally, and the local guy said, "Oh, very good idea, but we have other priorities. We'll do that next year." And so but that's the way it functions. And if they had small discussions locally on what seemed to have been a very politically intense debate 100 years ago, which might seem quite a detail today, they split up and they made another federation. And so the life went on like that, and everyone who was advocating that we have to adapt to the national level was crying in the desert until the 30s. The 30s, the crisis hit so hard at Belgian trade unions that they were losing massively members. They were starting to lose relevance. And in that crisis, they finally decided we're going to no longer be federations, we will be national trade unions. And they moved the decision-making process to the national level. Now the national board has the final decision-making process, and democracy is not deciding locally, but electing the guy who will decide jointly at the national level. They centralized their means, centralized staff, and they adapted to the playing field of the companies. And I really do believe that was the basis after the Second World War, it's only a few years later, that we built the welfare states on. Because we had, let's say, a coincidence of the way the economy was structured, the political powers, and the counterpower, we, the trade unions, demanding a decent life for our workers. And I think if you add 80 years and you translate this from national European, we're back in the same situation today. You could completely do the same story today, but between European trade union federations and national trade unions. And there I really think that that's not for tomorrow. It took us 40 years to do, and I do hope we will not take 40 years to do that at the European level, but at some time we have to change the psychology of things, and we have to allow the means necessary for European trade union federations, and they have to change. We have to allow that we adapt trade unions to the playing field that companies are playing on, because you cannot be a small player in a big field and think you're a real counterpower. So I would really add that psychological aspect, and it's difficult because people think that if you move to another level, decision-making is not that clear anymore, and you might not see all the details, and you have to lose some of the national differences that might be important to dispute about locally, but actually you lose relevance once you're in Europe. So I think that's the psychological aspect to add that, and although we're not that far yet to actually contribute more means and autonomy internationally, at least at the local level you can start working to do that. And that's something we're now experimenting with for the last 3-4 years. And that's very small, but again, you have to with small steps. And I don't want to bite the hand that's feeding me today, because most of the colleagues from international departments, I appreciate their work very much. But actually, in my second, the ICT, we try no longer to cooperate too much with the international department. We said my organizers, my permanent secretaries in my sector, if they don't speak 2-3 languages, I don't want them anymore. It's very crude, but it's now a selection criterion that we introduced. Of course, those who are there can follow a course, but they do have to be able to correlate with their colleagues abroad. And they do have to do their own international work. You cannot expect to be effective in an internationally organized company and negotiate at a national level and think that the international stuff is for someone else without any relation, because then you end up, and then I will conclude, and then you see the real challenge there today is that it's the organizations, but also the membership, because that's the way many of our members also position themselves in European Works Councils. When we had discussions, the reason that from UNI ICTS Industrial, we organized, I think, about 8-9 seminars over the last 3 years in a specific way, saying we want the select committee of a European Works Council for a week in a hotel somewhere, and officials from a trade union, debating the new directive, how to implement everything we have to do and to improve our rights that legally have been improved and so on and so on. But the underlying idea of the seminar was to convince them that they really need trade union support at European level. And I must say, in the ICT sector, that's not evident. Some companies now finally they said, yes, why not? Why shouldn't we have a constant trade union involvement? And it's helping them, it's improving the relationship. But many of the companies we saw are actually still thinking, is it really necessary? I have trade union involvement at home. Is it really, do I want a trade union at European level being there? And so I do think if we look in practice, let's try to, in the next years, try to not to wait until the crisis is so deep that we are willing to move on to the level the companies are operating on, but try to debate the psychological aspect today, the political aspect today, and let's try to debate and to agree on organizing ourselves at the same level the companies are organized to be a real counterbalance, a real counterpower again for the next 10 years.
Thank you very much, Koen. Credo che stai parlando di una sfida.
You're talking about a challenge, and I'm not exaggerating if I say that it is huge, but I think it is the challenge. I really agree with what you've said, and
Ha un'importanza.
and we also have to consider the psychological dimension. I now leave the floor to the our Spanish colleague Francisco Villalón, because from the standpoint of a federation, so the role played in the European coordination in this sector, he can provide his view. Thank you. Good morning to all.
Mi intervención prácticamente.
I want to practically start by reflecting on this question that the moderator was asking us at the beginning and trying to limit it to those 3 minutes. It'd have to be a very specific and concrete answer, but I will manage. And I want to start by saying that the first response is being here, the actual MuMMIA.Project. That is the first response. Why? Well, I'm saying it as the maximum political person in charge of an organization with the opportunity of being here, and many of the reflections that I'm doing, I would have never expressed them. Well, first of all, we have the study that situates us in a specific reality and forces us to approach it. We have not taken that into account. The moment that we are living in Europe, in our countries, in Spain, well, I could have never thought that the directive is a right that must be demanded of national companies which have this obligation. But within a year, our federation, our organizations, the national organizations have been involved in 3 general strikes. The crisis sets in motion all these problems as far as work, and it sets certain priority. It is not that we don't have the will to perform such jobs or tasks, but it is that other situations are more real, instantaneous, and ensure that other objectives or tasks are not at the initial at a level of priority. My first reflection allows me to speak of this opportunity. I'm convinced that the crisis bears many more negative aspects, especially for the society and the work environment, but it also forces us to search in this rush to search for solutions to the problem. It leads us to find possibilities to progress in as to other problems. I want to set some examples how it works. We're a small country with not so large companies in areas such as tourism. We have progressed in with a great concentration of hotel companies, hotel enterprises, and at this time in Spain, we have the obligation of not having less than 6 organizations in hotel companies, but the Spanish companies are really not geared at listening to us. Crisis is forcing them to face other needs. We've had a very intense negotiation, very powerful negotiation. We've reached some agreements that were painful, but what we were asked for by the companies was much worse. And as is a hotel chain with its majority ownership is in Spain, we have maintained a distance in the relation with the union organizations and also a will to go forward in our European dialogue. We constituted an EWC. The MuMMIA chain has the same attitude. I was employed by the MuMMIA chain for 36 years. I have a personal and political relation with the executive management, but they don't have this fear of the fact that non-compliance can have negative repercussions on them. They don't have this need, maybe minor on our part. The government does not force them to take a certain direction, and this ensures that this is part of that reflection that I was aiming at. And I'm convinced that the companies that do not need, the companies that must face these problems because of the crisis, well, we have the obligation as organization to extend our context of negotiation and respond to their needs. If they need us for a certain thing, well, we need them to understand, especially because I'm convinced that had we had a relation of permanent dialogue with respect to that need that we have and that right that we have of information and consultation, we could have faced the present problems in a different manner. We could have had that approach with a lot more advance, and we would have ensured that we could to present the reality of the company, and we could have established a different relation in this development of these facts. I think that this is fundamental, and then it must not stay just at the level of reflection, but it must go on to a commitment among the political authorities, the national organizations. The European Union is being questioned by the countries and individually and by the citizens, and I'm just referring to Spain. Spain has probably become the most European country, was probably the most European country 15 years ago, and now it is probably the least. I, on the contrary, am more European than I was 15 years ago because I'm convinced that the solution to our problems are not achieved thanks to less of Europe, rather more of Europe. Europe at the level of citizens, that is, with a greater participation of citizens and more logical democracy, and that allows us to face issues with greater reality and truth. This is a situation. Then there's one thing I don't want to forget, and I think, even though it was mentioned yesterday, I think that the crisis will also lead us to positive conclusions. We're not reinforce them, but also lead us to tragedies. We were talking about the Bangladesh tragedy yesterday. There are specific things that some companies, and I'm saying it because there are also multinational Spanish companies that are involved and which have participated in that sort of exploitation. If we had information or a consultation of the conditions of those workers, where those companies foster these conditions, we would also have the obligation to intervene in advance to avoid those tragedies from happening. This is a situation in which well, the only instrument we have to face these situations are the EWCs. There's no other. I have two more issues to discuss. I don't want to abuse of my time. First, I wanted to thank the companions, our colleagues, Gabriele especially, for the possibility of being here because this work is very enriching for us. I took on the political responsibility within my organization at the national level in my country so that this commitment, and I want this commitment to be permanent, and I want to congratulate you for this project and for the will you have applied to make it come true. Thank you so much.
Passiamo immediatamente.
Let us go on to the intervention of our guest of this initiative, of this a guest of the organization that is supporting this project, Giuliana Mizina from the Secretarial Office of FICA. Welcome. Thank you all, as I was saying yesterday, for the presence and active participation to this initiative. And then a specific thank you to Francisco because he offered me the hook to say that one of the elements that are constructive and that can allow us to overcome this problem for us are initiatives such as this. So this project dimension uniting some minds to reason about some transversal topics in addition to cross sectors as this one, allowing a concrete collaboration because suffice it to see the logos and the programs, the number of partners, and it's not simple to join all these minds to speak of a topic that is joining so many heads and union organizations, federations, and confederations around the same table to search for common practices and solutions. So it is undoubtedly one of the elements in which we believe. Then, since I'm talking as a federation, a trade federation, and in this reasoning, I consider myself like the last link of this chain. From this standpoint, those who are the ones who are facing the workers, the places of work in this type of European culture. So obviously trying to increase the workers' participation because the Italian colleagues will recognize a sentence that is very dear to us because it was from a composer that we are fond of, which stated democracy and participation. But it is true that democracy is strengthened and it is made more effective through knowledge. So from this standpoint, to ensure that our participation, which is democracy, is more effective, we need to implement our level of knowledge. So that is why, as far as a proposal from our standpoint, in this climate of crisis, which often forces us to manage problems in an emergency state, so risks, to put initiatives such as this on the second level, we chose to become active through initiatives and provisions that are that oppose the cycles, because we believe we can get out of the crisis with an opposition to the cycle and not with austerity. So we have destined a growing share of the FILCAM's GNP to formation, to training in times of crisis. This is probably against the current. So training also specifically with respect to the issues such as the EWC directive or the multinationals, transnationalism, and cross sectors. These are elements that difficult that hardly sees us because of all the issues that were presented and felt by all the federations and confederations, because we're not exempt from this suffering. However, with difficulty, we believe in the fact that this initiative is to allow us to reinforce and strengthen our relationships, relationships of power, and we are concentrating, we are focusing, because we want to somehow attack or tackle two of the issues that already emerged from these addresses that came before mine. One is the slowness, this lack of speed that we have with respect to multinationals and companies in the capacity to transform ourselves, make decisions or change. We are somehow bound to the building of a consensus through democratic mechanisms, even through our mechanisms. Those were slower. So in order to be faster, we want to be more encultured, if I may say so. We have to know more. We have to be more familiar with mechanisms. We have to invest in the training at all levels, because this allows a setup of decisions and a quicker consensus. Another element of weakness, or another problem, another critical issue that emerged, is the weakness in the negotiation of the EWCs, also based on what is anticipated by the directive. These are organizations for consultation, but they have quite a limited organization. But it is true, and I'm setting the example of my country. For example, I follow those two from a contractual standpoint. For instance, the area of information technology, where we seldom have the mother house in Italy, but where we can find a negotiation table that manages a negotiation, so relationships of force based on decisions that are made away from that table, whose marginality and the possibility to change them in some manner is outside of this negotiation table. So it is obvious that there are critical points about these issues. We are trying to search for elements to act and react, and one of the elements that we can use is to make this approach to turn this into a dual approach. So not just the EWCs can help at the European level regarding problems that then become that then affect the individual organizations at the national level, but they can also be a vice versa. So we can attempt to pollute or contaminate from a different negotiation power in the several countries, to try to infect or involve in these occasions of meeting of EWCs, to involve them by participating in these struggles in each individual country, which face very different issues. This happened with IKEA, if I'm not mistaken, and then now the issue about alliances that we will deal with in the second part of the morning. We face on a daily basis in companies from other sectors. For instance, I referred to another company that I serve personally, American Express, with which we have a relationship of force in Italy that is probably more powerful, and which allows us to obtain a more favorable bargaining dynamic, which sometimes manages to contaminate, to infect what that then happens at a European level. These are probably micro signs, micro movements, which, however, suggest that that is an approach that can be adopted and strengthened. I want to go back on the issue of resources. Yes, it is probably a political problem. I agree. And this too can partially find its responses in each individual country from a negotiation standpoint, and I'm referring to those who carry out the negotiations in their own countries. For example, metro cash and carry, since we have the representative of the Italian EWC with us in the Italian contract for metro cash and carry. There's an eligibility. There's a flexibility of this company which offers resources and offers us to have these resources available to have the EWC participate. And this is a small element that we hope to reinforce, to strengthen in the future, which could translate into always greater resources to be destined to this sort of activity, because that's where we also become familiar with projects which will then impact on our country, and that's how we can also build up some alliances to then reinforce our negotiation